Welcome to another deep dive.
Oh, yeah.
Today, we're going to be looking at something pretty intense.
Okay.
How the U.S. military thinks it could actually win a war with China if one ever broke out over Taiwan,
Right.
which is, a distinct possibility.
Oh, absolutely.
The really fascinating part here is that it's not just about winning any old way.
Right.
We're talking about a conflict with a nuclear-armed superpower.
Mm-hmm.
So victory has to come without, triggering the apocalypse.
Right. Yeah, the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
We're basing this deep dive on a 2024 report from the RAND Corporation.
Okay.
It's called U.S. Military Theories of Victory for a War with the People's Republic of China.
Catchy title.
Yeah. And it doesn't sugarcoat things at all.
Yeah.
One of the things that really jumped out at me was how clearly it lays out the possibility of the U.S. losing.
Yeah.
And losing badly.
It's a completely different situation than what the U.S. has faced in recent conflicts.
Right.
Like, think back to Iraq or Afghanistan. Those were fights against much weaker opponents.
Yeah.
Where the risk of total U.S. defeat was practically non-existent.
But with China,
Yeah.
it's a whole different ballgame.
All different ballgame.
Both countries have the ability to inflict massive damage.
Mm-hmm.
And the RAND report really drives home this new reality of great power conflict.
It does. And it's crazy.
Right.
Back in the 90s and early 2000s, the U.S. could pretty much count on total victory in its wars.
Right.
The possibility of us being destroyed was almost unthinkable.
Yeah.
But now
that possibility is very much on the table.
very much.
The report actually uses some visuals to show this.
Yeah.
It's striking how limited the options become when you're talking about two nuclear-armed superpowers.
Exactly.
And that's why the U.S. has to be incredibly careful about what it's actually trying to achieve in a conflict like this.
Mm-hmm.
Aiming for total victory against China is
It's not realistic.
not realistic anymore.
No.
So the report lays out 5 potential paths to victory. They call them theories of victory.
I like it.
Dominance denial, devaluing brinkmanship, and military cost imposition.
All right, so let's walk through these.
Yeah, let's walk through these.
Yeah.
Dominance meaning just completely crushing the enemy's military.
Right.
That's pretty much off the table right away, right?
Right. Imagine trying to completely dismantle China's military.
Yeah.
It's just not a practical goal.
Yeah.
Especially given their nuclear capabilities.
And then there's devaluing, which is basically trying to make Taiwan itself less appealing to conquer.
Yeah.
But isn't that kind of passing the buck?
Well, yes.
Like making Taiwan suffer so China won't want it.
But the report acknowledges it's ethically questionable.
Yeah.
Plus, it's unlikely to work given how deeply committed China is to Taiwan.
Yeah.
Both politically and ideologically. And it completely ignores how Taiwan would feel about being devalued.
And of course we have brinkmanship.
Yeah.
Which honestly sounds terrifying. It's basically threatening to escalate things to such an extreme level that China backs down out of fear.
Right.
Isn't that insanely risky?
It is. The report is pretty clear that brinkmanship is too dangerous and unpredictable to rely on.
Yeah.
The potential for miscalculation is huge, and the consequences could be catastrophic.
So that leaves us with 2 main contenders.
Okay.
Denial and military cost imposition.
All right.
What struck me was how much the report seems to favor denial as the most promising approach.
What's interesting about denial is that it's very focused.
Okay.
The goal is to stop China from achieving its objective in Taiwan, taking control of the island.
So it's not about wiping out the entire Chinese military,
Right.
but more about targeting the specific things they need to successfully invade Taiwan.
Right. The report highlights how important it is to disrupt China's ability to get its forces onto Taiwan's shores.
Okay.
They talk a lot about U.S. submarine warfare as a potential game changer in that regard.
But the report also acknowledges that pulling this off is getting harder as China's military continues to grow and modernize.
No doubt it's a constant challenge.
Yeah.
But even with all their advancements, the report argues that amphibious invasions are inherently difficult and risky.
Right.
Think about it.
Yeah.
You're trying to move a massive force across water, land it on a hostile shore, and establish a beachhead.
Right.
It's a logistical nightmare, even for a powerful military like China's.
And I guess you only have to disrupt it, not totally defeat it,
Right.
for denial to work.
Right.
Not to mention the U.S. still seems to have a technological advantage in key areas, especially with submarines and air power.
And we can't forget about U.S. allies.
Oh, right, yeah.
The report makes a big point about how Japan and Australia are stepping up their military capabilities and planning to play a more active role in the region.
Okay, so denial sounds promising.
Yeah.
But what if China tries something else?
Like what?
What if they try to blockade Taiwan instead of invading outright? Would that undermine the whole denial strategy?
That's a really good question, and the report actually tackles that directly.
Okay.
The idea is that if the U.S. can successfully deny China in an invasion, that sends a powerful message that other options, like a blockade, are also unlikely to work.
So it's not just about winning that one battle.
Right.
It's about shattering their confidence and making them rethink their whole approach.
Yes, exactly. Plus, there are other factors that would come into play.
Okay.
International pressure, economic sanctions.
Right.
All of those could further discourage China from continuing a fight they're likely to lose.
But here's something that really struck me.
Okay.
The report talks about this idea of the nuclear-armed protracted war paradox.
No, yeah.
Can you explain that?
Sure.
It seemed pretty mind-blowing.
The paradox is this: historically, wars between great powers often turn into long, drawn-out affairs.
Right.
But in the nuclear age, the idea of a protracted war between countries like the U.S. and China is absolutely terrifying.
It's like, how can you have a long war without risking the end of the world?
Exactly. And the report explores two potential ways to avoid a nuclear catastrophe in a prolonged conflict.
Okay.
The first is the classic mutual assured destruction scenario,
Right.
where both sides are so afraid of being annihilated that they don't dare use nuclear weapons.
But that's a pretty unstable foundation for peace.
Right.
Don't you think?
It's basically hoping that fear will keep everyone in check.
Yeah.
Which doesn't sound very reassuring.
So what's the second option?
Deliberate restraint.
Okay.
It means both sides would have to actively avoid attacking certain targets or using certain weapons, even if it meant prolonging the conflict.
So it's about staying cool-headed.
Right.
And understanding the bigger picture, even when things are really bad.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that be incredibly difficult to maintain?
Absolutely.
Especially in the heat of battle.
It would require immense disciplined communication and, honestly, a bit of luck.
It seems like even with the best intentions,
Yeah.
a protracted war would be a tightrope walk, with the potential for things to go very wrong very quickly.
That's right. Which is why the report emphasizes the importance of giving China a way out.
Okay.
A way to end the war without suffering a humiliating defeat that might push them toward more desperate measures.
So it's not just about the U.S. achieving its objectives.
Right.
It's about creating the conditions for a stable resolution to the conflict.
Precisely. And that brings us to the second major theory of victory: military cost imposition.
Okay.
This one is all about making the war so painful for China that they decide it's simply not worth it to continue fighting.
Okay, but isn't that incredibly risky?
It is.
I mean, how do you inflict enough pain to change their minds without pushing them to do something truly drastic, like resorting to nuclear weapons?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And the report calls this the Goldilocks challenge.
Yeah.
You have to find that sweet spot.
Okay.
Hitting targets that are valuable enough to make China reconsider the invasion, but not so valuable that they trigger an all-out retaliation.
So we can't just go after anything.
No.
We have to carefully choose our targets,
Right.
knowing exactly what will hurt them without causing a meltdown.
Right.
Did the report give any examples of this Goldilocks challenge?
Actually, yes. They use this really fascinating historical example from the Cold War.
Okay.
Back in 1980, the U.S. was planning for a potential Soviet invasion of Iran.
So back when the U.S. and the Soviet Union were staring each other down,
Exactly.
both with their fingers on the nuclear button.
Exactly. And just like with the China-Taiwan scenario today,
Yeah.
U.S. analysts back then struggled to find good target options. They couldn't figure out how to pressure the Soviets into backing down without risking a full-blown nuclear war.
So even with all the intelligence and planning resources the U.S. had back then,
Yeah,
finding that sweet spot proved incredibly difficult.
it did.
You're telling me it's no easier today,
That's what the report seems to suggest, yes.
even with all our advanced technology?
Yeah, it's tough.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the potential targets they mentioned.
Okay.
What about military targets? Could hitting those be enough to force China's hand?
Well, the report argues that just focusing on military targets might not be enough,
Okay,
unless it's combined with a successful denial campaign.
right.
Remember, China has likely already factored in the possibility of heavy military losses as part of their invasion calculus.
So even if we blow up a bunch of their ships and tanks,
Right.
it might not change their overall strategy.
It might not.
What about economic targets?
Like,
Like a blockade?
uh-huh.
Could that work?
That's an interesting idea. But a blockade has its own set of problems.
Okay.
First, it might take a long time to really cripple China's economy,
Right.
especially since they've been working hard to diversify their supply chains and become less reliant on maritime trade routes.
Right. They realized their vulnerability to a blockade a while ago.
They did?
It seems like they've been working for years to lessen their dependence on certain choke points.
That's right. They've been investing heavily in alternative rights and infrastructure,
Yeah.
especially around the Strait of Malacca, to try and mitigate that risk.
So maybe going after infrastructure directly would be more effective.
Well, the report suggests that directly attacking Chinese infrastructure,
Right.
especially anything that impacts civilians, would almost certainly provoke a very aggressive response.
Yeah.
It would be seen as a major escalation.
It all keeps coming back to that Goldilocks challenge.
It does.
Finding that delicate balance between hurting them enough without pushing them over the edge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And even if the U.S. could figure out exactly the right pressure points to hit,
Yeah.
there's another massive hurdle, the credible assurance problem.
Okay, I have to admit, I'm not sure what that means.
Okay.
Can you explain it in plain English?
Basically, it means that even if the U.S. could inflict a lot of pain on China,
Uh-huh.
China needs to believe that the pain will actually stop once they give up on Taiwan.
So it's not enough to punish them.
Right.
We have to convince them that there's a way out,
Exactly.
that if they change course, we'll ease up.
Exactly. And here's the thing. The report points out that China already deeply mistrusts the U.S. and its intentions.
Yeah.
Launching a cost-imposition campaign, even if we do it with restraint, would probably reinforce those suspicions.
So they might see it as part of a larger plot to weaken them or even topple their government,
That's the danger.
regardless of what we say our intentions are.
And it makes ending the war even more difficult.
Right.
Because from China's perspective, accepting defeat might feel like an existential threat.
Wow. So even if we find those magic Goldilocks targets,
Yeah.
there's no guarantee it'll actually work the way we want it to.
You got it. And this all goes back to the question of whether denial is even a realistic option in the first place.
Right.
Can the U.S. actually pull off a successful denial campaign against China's rapidly growing military?
That's a great question.
That's what we'll explore next. It's
Yeah.
the question, isn't it? And the Rand report really grapples with this. They acknowledge that things have gotten much more difficult in recent years.
Yeah. I remember reading somewhere that around the year 2000, Taiwan could have probably defended itself
Right.
with just a little bit of help from the U.S. But then China went on this massive military spending spree. And by 2010, it was pretty clear the balance of power was shifting.
Right. And the report talks about how by the mid-2010s, there were serious doubts emerging about whether the U.S. could actually prevent China from taking Taiwan.
Weren't there some war games conducted by the U.S. Air Force around that time
Yeah.
that didn't end so well for the U.S. side?
Yeah, in 2018 and 2019.
Yeah.
Those war games suggested that if a conflict broke out, then the U.S. would have a very hard time stopping a Chinese invasion.
I can see why some people might look at that and say, well, if denial's not possible, we better have a backup plan,
Right.
even if that backup plan is something as risky as cost imposition.
That's a tempting conclusion, but the report pushes back against that kind of fatalism. It argues that there are still several reasons to believe denial might be feasible, even though it's undeniably gotten harder.
Yeah. Okay, give me some hope here. What are those reasons?
First, you have to remember that launching an amphibious invasion is ridiculously hard. Even for a military as advanced as China's,
Yeah.
it requires insane levels of coordination logistics, a ton of specialized equipment, and honestly, a lot of luck.
So China can't just assume they'll waltz onto Taiwan's beaches and declare victory.
Exactly. Plus, remember, the U.S. doesn't have to annihilate the Chinese military to make denial work. It just has to disrupt the invasion enough to make it fail. And the geography of the Taiwan Strait actually helps the U.S. here.
Really? How so?
The waters of the Taiwan Strait are relatively shallow,
Okay.
and there's a lot of complex underwater terrain that makes it tough for China to detect and target U.S. submarines.
Right.
And those submarines, especially the attack submarines, could do a lot of damage to the transport ships China would need to get its troops and equipment across the strait.
So it's about playing to U.S. strengths and exploiting China's weaknesses.
Right. Plus, you've got the fact that the U.S. still has a significant technological edge over China, especially in areas like submarines, air power, and those long-range missiles that can hit targets from far away.
But didn't you say earlier that China is rapidly modernizing its military?
Yeah.
Are we really sure we're still ahead in the tech race?
It's a close race, but the report is pretty confident that the U.S. still holds an advantage in key areas. And it's not just about the U.S. either. The report also emphasizes that U.S. allies are stepping up their game. They're increasing their military spending and investing in new capabilities, which could help tip the balance in favor of denial.
So it's becoming a more collective effort to deter China.
Right.
Who are the key players here besides the U.S.?
Japan is probably the most important. They're planning to double their defense budget and acquire long-range missiles, which would give them the ability to strike targets deep inside China. Australia is also strengthening its ties with the U.S. and Japan, and they're looking to play a more active role in regional security.
Okay, so all of this, the tech advantage, the allies getting more involved, could help offset the fact that China's military is growing so fast.
That's the hope. The report even lays out two possible scenarios for the future. In the pessimistic scenario, China continues its rapid military buildup, and the U.S. has to make some really tough choices. Either accept a higher risk of losing Taiwan, or resort to much riskier strategies like cost imposition or brinkmanship.
Yeah, neither of those options sounds very appealing.
Yeah.
What about the optimistic scenario?
In that scenario, China's military growth slows down. Maybe they run into economic problems or internal political pressures. Whatever the reason, if that growth slows, the U.S. has more breathing room to make denial work in the long term.
So it's not a lost cause.
Yeah.
There's still a chance to make denial work.
Right.
But it depends on a lot of factors outside our control.
A lot of factors.
But even if denial does work,
Uh-huh.
and that's a big IF,
Yeah.
what's to stop China from just shifting to a different tactic?
Yeah.
We talked earlier about a blockade.
Right.
Couldn't they just try that instead?
Well, the report actually argues that a successful denial would deter that kind of move. If China sees that a direct invasion is impossible, they're less likely to try something else that's also probably going to fail.
So it's about breaking their will,
Yeah.
making them realize that any attempt to take Taiwan by force is doomed to fail,
Uh-huh.
no matter what approach they take.
Exactly. And you have to remember, a failed invasion would be incredibly costly for China, both militarily and in terms of their reputation. They'd have to rebuild their forces, deal with potential economic sanctions, and face the political fallout of humiliating defeat.
But isn't it possible they double down? I mean, China seems really determined to take Taiwan, and they have a lot of resources. Couldn't they just keep throwing troops and equipment at the problem until they eventually wear down the U.S. and its allies?
That's a possibility the report doesn't shy away from. They acknowledge that China might be willing to endure a long and painful conflict if they think they can eventually win. And that raises a truly unsettling question. Can nuclear-armed powers like the U.S. and China really fight a protracted war without eventually resorting to nuclear weapons?
It's almost unthinkable, isn't it?
It is.
We've seen throughout history that wars between great powers can drag on for years.
Right.
But the existence of nuclear weapons makes that prospect terrifying.
It's a paradox. The report calls it the nuclear-armed protracted war paradox, and it tries to grapple with how to avoid the worst-case scenario. They talk about two potential solutions, but honestly, neither of them is all that comforting.
Let's hear them. What's the first one?
The first solution is the one we've all been taught to fear: mutual assured destruction. The idea that both sides are so terrified of being obliterated in a nuclear exchange that they won't dare use those weapons.
It's like hoping that fear alone will keep us safe. Not exactly the most inspiring vision for global security. What's the second solution?
The second solution is something called deliberate restraint. It means both sides would have to actively avoid using certain weapons or attacking certain targets, even if it meant prolonging the war.
It's like fighting with one hand tied behind your back. But wouldn't that be incredibly hard to maintain, especially as a war drags on and the pressure to escalate mounts?
You're telling me it would take a lot of discipline, clear communication between the two sides, and probably a healthy dose of good luck.
So even with the best of intentions, a protracted war would be incredibly risky. You're constantly walking a tightrope, hoping you don't make a mistake that triggers something truly catastrophic.
And that's why the report keeps coming back to this idea of giving China an off-ramp.
Right.
They need a way to end the war without feeling like they've been completely humiliated, which might push them toward more desperate measures.
So it's not just about winning. It's about winning in a way that allows the other side to save face and maybe even de-escalate the situation later on. But honestly, I'm having trouble imagining that. Can China really accept anything less than total victory, especially when it comes to something as important to them as Taiwan?
That's the key question. It's a tough one. The report acknowledges that China sees Taiwan as a core national interest, and they've invested a lot of political capital in the idea of reunification.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine them just backing down after a failed invasion and saying, well, that didn't work. Guess we'll try again in a few decades.
Right, and that's where the real danger lies. If they feel backed into a corner, they might be willing to take extreme risks, maybe even threaten to use nuclear weapons rather than accept a loss.
So what can the U.S. do to prevent that? I mean, is there any way to convince China that accepting a limited defeat wouldn't be the end of the world for them?
Well, the report argues that's exactly why keeping U.S. war aims limited is so important. It's not just about minimizing American risk, it's about making it easier for China to swallow a defeat without feeling like their entire regime is at stake.
So instead of trying to force them to renounce all claims to Taiwan or trying to topple the Communist Party, we'd be better off just focusing on preventing them from taking control of the island.
Exactly. And this is where denial has a real advantage over cost imposition.
Okay.
It's about thwarting a specific action, the invasion, rather than trying to inflict broader punishment or regime change.
Didn't the report have an analogy for this?
Yes.
Something about the Falklands War?
Yes, they compared it to the Falklands War between the UK and Argentina back in the 80s. The UK's goal was to retake the islands, not to force Argentina to give up its claim to them.
Right.
And while that territorial dispute continues to this day, both sides were able to avoid a larger conflict.
So it's possible to end a war without completely resolving the underlying political issues. At least that's somewhat reassuring. But let's be real. China is not Argentina. They're way more powerful. And Taiwan is way more important to them than the Falklands were to Argentina.
That's true. The analogy isn't perfect, but it does highlight the potential for de-escalation and finding some kind of equilibrium, even if it's an uneasy one.
But even if China does back down after a failed invasion, isn't it likely they try to spin it as a victory?
Oh, absolutely.
I could totally see them claiming they taught Taiwan a lesson or exposed U.S. weaknesses.
The report acknowledges that. And that's where the messaging, the propaganda war, becomes really important. The U.S. and its allies would need to very clearly communicate what actually happened and counter any attempts by China to distort the narrative.
So it's not enough to win on the battlefield, you also have to win the information war.
You do.
What would that look like in practice?
It would mean being very transparent about U.S. war aims from the start, making it clear that the goal was to defend Taiwan, not to attack mainland China or try to overthrow the Chinese government. It would also mean working closely with allies to present a united front and push back against Chinese disinformation.
So it's about demonstrating resolve but also restraint.
Right.
Showing that we're willing to fight if necessary.
Yes.
But also that we're committed to a peaceful resolution.
Exactly. And that, in a nutshell, is why denial emerges as the most promising theory of victory. It balances those competing imperatives, the need to defend Taiwan and deter Chinese aggression while also minimizing the risk of catastrophic escalation.
But as we've discussed, even with denial, there are no guarantees. It's a risky strategy, and there's a lot that could go wrong.
No doubt. And that's where the report leaves us with this final thought-provoking question. What does it say about a U.S. president's mindset if they decide to rely on cost imposition instead of denial?
Interesting. Are they so pessimistic about the U.S. military's ability to defend Taiwan that they're willing to gamble on a much riskier strategy, even knowing it could lead to a nuclear conflict?
That's the implication. Choosing cost imposition over denial could be a sign that they don't believe denial is feasible or that they're willing to accept much higher levels of risk. It's a very dangerous gamble.
It's like saying, we can't stop the invasion, so let's just try to make it hurt so much that China gives up. Which, as we've seen, could have disastrous unintended consequences.
And that's why it's so crucial to pay attention to how the U.S. and its allies are investing in their militaries. Are they making choices that will make denial possible, or are they hedging their bets and preparing for other more dangerous scenarios?
Wow. It's kind of mind-blowing to think that the decisions being made today about budgets and weapon systems and alliances could determine whether a war over Taiwan can be won without risking a global catastrophe.
It really highlights the stakes involved. This isn't just about military hardware and strategy. It's about understanding how decisions are made, how conflicts escalate, and how important it is to communicate clearly and try to understand the other side's perspective.
I'm walking away from this deep dive with a mix of anxiety and, I guess, a cautious sense of hope. Anxiety because the choices we make in the coming years will have such enormous consequences, but also hope because it seems like there are still paths to avoid the worst-case scenarios.
It's a delicate balance, for sure, but that's the reality of living in a world with nuclear weapons. The possibility of catastrophic conflict is always there lurking in the background.
What really stood out to me was the idea that denial is probably our best bet. but it requires a sustained commitment from the U.S. and its allies. It also requires clear-headed strategic leadership that understands both the power and the limits of military force.
Couldn't agree more. And it requires a willingness to engage in tough conversations about risk, about restraint, and about the potential costs of conflict.
Well said. This has been a really fascinating and sobering deep dive. Thanks for walking me through it.
Thanks for having me. I hope this has given you and everyone listening a better understanding of what's at stake in this increasingly complex and dangerous rivalry between the U.S. and China.
It certainly has. Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.
Yeah.
This is something we all need to be thinking about.